in God's plan for the world. And secondly, it's good to know this, that the Catholic Church has no organisation set up for the conversion of the Jewish people. Perhaps we should be speaking more about a common mission as synagogue and church. So, it's with a purified mind and deep humility that we now turn to St. Paul, and we begin, of course, with those opening 5 verses. And we see a very grief-stricken and sad Paul, because his brothers and sisters have not accepted Christ. My sorrow is so great, and my mental anguish endless. He even says that if he could help them become believers, he'd be happy to be cut off from Christ. A bit like how Moses prayed to be blotted out from the book of life so that the unworthy Israelites might be forgiven. He uses the honorific religious title Israel, and then he lists 7 historic prerogatives associated with this name. God's people, the Jewish people, are beloved sons and daughters. They have the glory of God's presence. They have covenants with God, especially the covenant of Sinai. They are blessed to possess the Torah, the law. They have ritual and worship ordained by God. They are heirs of the promises made to the patriarchs. And of course, they have the patriarchs. And so to this glorious list, Paul adds an 8th privilege, that the Christ, the Messiah, who is thoroughly Jewish, comes from them. It's such a beautiful, moving few verses to see that. This glory, beauty of Israel culminating in the Messiah. Okay, let's move now to the second section of our lecture today. God is always faithful and just and supremely free. In the opening, the first section, verses 6 to 13 of chapter 9, we have this question. Does this mean that God has failed to keep his promise? Of course not. Paul's saying this. God made important promises to Abraham, and he'll always keep them. He'll always be faithful to them, but in a way that is surprising. And he gives of how this has taken place the example of Abraham and his children, Ishmael and Isaac. God restricts the promise of Isaac's lineage alone, ignoring one whole branch of the family, Ishmael. So God's promises rest on Isaac. And Paul says that God has another principle in his mind as he's doing that, not just bloodline, because it's God's free choice to choose Isaac and not to choose Ishmael. A second example is Isaac himself with his 2 children, Jacob and Esau. God chooses not to use the natural order of things. So he doesn't choose the elder son Esau, but he chooses Jacob, the younger one, instead. And calls this, and all this rather, is in order to stress that God's choice is free, says St. Paul. God's way of acting is often surprising, and it's always in God's prerogative to act as God wishes. He can achieve his purpose in any way God chooses. Paul obviously is preparing us for a wider understanding of who belongs to Israel, and is telling us that God is supremely free in whom he wishes to include in the Jewish people. Our second section now, verses 14 to 18, after we've been confronted with the fate of Ishmael and Esau, begins with, does it follow that God's unjust? What happened to poor old Ishmael and poor old Esau? Of course not, says St. Paul. And here Paul argues that when God's mercy is involved, every other consideration, including is God just and fair, falls apart, falls into second place. Or as he puts it, the only thing that really counts is not what human beings want or try to do, but the mercy of God. In the struggle between the Israelites and the Egyptians, God's mercy reaches out to the oppressed, and Moses their leader. And in the process, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. But that allows the liberation of the Israelites to take place. So a wider plan of salvation is fulfilled. Father Joseph Fitzmyer comments on this hardening of Pharaoh's heart like this. In the Old Testament, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is ascribed at times to God and at times to Pharaoh himself. Well, it's a way of expressing divine reaction to persistent human obstinacy, a sealing of a situation that he didn't really want to create. It's not the result of some arbitrary or even divine decision of God that Pharaoh's heart is hardened. It's the Old Testament way of expressing God's recognition of a situation arising from a creature that rejects divine invitation. But it does bring out, this way of speaking, God's utter control of human history. The Exodus from Egypt was a phase in salvation history, and Pharaoh, who opposed Israel's departure, was a figure setting the stage for the divine control of events. We move now to the third section, verses 19 to 21. Paul now raises the problem of, are we free? Or is God really controlling us, a bit like puppets? In that case, says Paul, how can God ever blame anyone, since no one can oppose his will? Paul's answer is that the Creator is never accountable to the creature, to human beings. And he uses, in a sense, one of the strongest lessons that the book of Job tells us. What right have you, a human being, to cross-examine God? Paul uses the beautiful analogy of the potter and the clay image. And he quotes Isaiah chapter 29, verse 16. The pot has no right to say to the potter, why did you make me this shape? Now this image of the potter and the clay pot, the image, is found frequently in the Old Testament. And Bishop Tom Wright makes a very excellent comment on all the quotations, all the uses rather, of that image. They are all worth reflecting on, he says. They tell of a stage in Israel's history when God was struggling with a rebellious Israel, like a potter working with clay that simply wouldn't go into the right shape. The image of potter and clay wasn't designed to speak in general terms about human beings